give the floor to Rapporteur Mrs. Honeyball. The floor is yours. The microphone, please.
Greetings to all of you on International Women's Day. This report on women refugees and asylum seekers is about bringing a much-needed gender perspective to the way we in the European Union deal with those seeking safety within our borders. At present, there are worrying disparities in the way different EU member states handle asylum claims, particularly where those claims are related to gender. As a result, women seeking asylum in the EU are not guaranteed consistent gender-sensitive treatment. Women refugees and women seeking asylum are too often confronted with policies which fail to meet acceptable standards, where sensitive policies regarding gender are not implemented in practice. This report recommends a new set of gender guidelines to address these shortcomings. Violence is tragically an everyday reality for women and girls fleeing conflict, and I have heard horrifying reports of women being exploited and abused. Research shows that women and girls refugees face this kind of violence, assault, exploitation and sexual harassment at every stage of their journey, including on European soil. Women, and indeed children, who are entitled to claim asylum are being coerced into transactional sex and forced into prostitution to pay for travel documents or a place in a boat or on a lorry. Traffickers and smugglers are having a field day with these desperate people. Women need safer alternatives, as this report sets out. Pressure on the asylum reception systems should never excuse failure to protect women from violence, nor should women seeking asylum and women refugees experience any double standards. They should have the same rights as other victims of gender-based violence. I very much welcome the news in the past few days that the European Commission has proposed accession of the EU to the Istanbul Convention. The Istanbul Convention is the most comprehensive treaty on violence against women in the world today and requires states to interpret the Refugee Convention in a gender-sensitive manner. It also requires states to implement reception and asylum procedures which are sensitive to the needs of women and girls. The proposal will now be discussed in the Council and in this Parliament, whose consent is needed for the conclusion of the Convention by the EU. Only 12 member states have already ratified the Convention and another 13 have yet to do so. But we also need to look at the longer-term issues. We often talk of refugees as presenting a burden or bringing only costs to the countries which host them. However, with adequate investment, this need not be the case in the longer term. As we are all aware, I know, refugees have much to offer our societies in the longer term. But we need to think carefully and develop integration strategies that are relevant to everyone. Women have specific integration and inclusion needs, such as childcare and language training. Many will not have been active in the labour market, so we need to look at properly matching skills and training provision with labour market shortages. Over 30 years ago, this Parliament acknowledged the need for a gender-sensitive interpretation of the Refugee Convention in a resolution in 1984. This was even before the UNHCR adopted gender guidelines. It would therefore be a huge step backwards if we were failed to adopt this resolution today. Women and children now make up the majority of those seeking protection in the EU. The UN estimates it's now 55%. It is vital that we have the necessary policies and procedures in place to meet their needs. We need an approach which takes account of gender at every stage of their journey undertaken by these women refugees and provide the kind of protection that they need and should expect from the European Union.
I will give the floor to Commissioner Jourová.
Madam President, honourable members, I would like to thank the rapporteur, Madam Honeyball, and the shadow rapporteurs and members who have contributed to this very important report and their excellent work. This report highlights a very important aspect of the migration crisis, assuring the rights and needs of women and girls who are fleeing conflicts and wars. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, 20% of Mediterranean sea arrivals since 1 January 2016 are women and 33% are children. The EU has international obligations to provide protection and humanitarian support to those who need it. I fully support your general recommendation that safe and legal routes to the EU must be made available for those fleeing conflict and persecution. No legislation and policies relating to irregular migration should ever prevent access to protection inside the EU. We need to provide credible alternatives for irregular migration and enhance our legal channels. The Commission will soon come up with proposals in this respect. We have to proactively ensure that the newly arrived who receive protection are enabled to participate and fully integrate in our societies. The success of integration depends on its timelines. Women face much stronger barriers than other migrants, suffering from multiple disadvantages. We need to act on this. The provision of services has been tailored to the needs of women, considering in particular childcare responsibilities. The Commission foresees to present further steps on improving integration in April 2016. Of course, the gender dimension will play an important role in this respect. Let me underline how important the commitment and support of Member States is, which have already important instruments at their disposal. The European Social Fund, as well as the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund. Both should be used to better respond to women's needs. The Commission is working to address the challenge of protecting women from violence, the risk of exploitation and enslavement. As regards the fight against migrant smuggling, the Commission has already presented an action plan last year. In this context, we will propose this year to strengthen the existing legal framework. The Commission has already set out various elements on the issue of trafficking in the EU agendas on migration and security and the EU Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy for the years 2015 to 2019. I would also like to draw attention to the legal obligation of Member States to take measures to reduce demand, the importance of criminalisation, the use of services of victims and paying attention to all forms of exploitation. The Commission prioritises the fight against trafficking in human beings as a human rights issue. We raise this in dialogues with third countries. You call in particular on the EU to access the Istanbul Convention on preventing and combating violence against women. I am happy to inform you that last week, on 4 March 2016, the Commission has adopted the proposal for the EU accession to this Convention, which is a comprehensive instrument to tackle the widespread phenomenon of violence against women. In conclusion, let me be clear. Europe will continue to provide protection for those who need it, including for women and girls seeking refuge in the EU. Actions of all the relevant stakeholders at European and national level should be mutually reinforcing, and concerted efforts should translate into more protection and effective integration policies for women refugees. I thank you again for this report.
Thanks. And now I will give the floor to Mrs.
Thank Thank you, President. I'd like to thank Mrs. Honeyball for her work. But it is a pity, however, that we didn't, on the occasion of this International Women's Day, manage to overcome some differences that occurred during the drafting of this report. That's a pity. According to the most recent statistics, 38% of asylum seekers in Europe are women. Bearing this in mind, I appreciated the fact that within the report Mrs. Honeyball has inserted all the references to a European migratory policy which is sensitive to the needs of women and children and the needs of refugees and asylum seekers after exhausting journeys fleeing from danger and violence who then arrive at the European border. I also took on board the request for a humanitarian approach to those most vulnerable categories such as pregnant women, children and elderly. At the same time, I criticise the insertion within the text of paragraphs which refer to asylum procedures, family reunification, or even these very expensive requests for legal advice for women refugees. So in this way we are interfering in the migratory policies of individual member states of the European Union, but we're also going beyond our powers because we are the Women's Rights, Equality and Gender Committee, and these topics are being dealt with on a daily basis by the Libe Committee, which is the committee that concentrates on justice and civil rights. So as the EPP group, we decided that we would propose an alternative motion of resolution designed to stress the need for a humane approach to the migratory crisis, which does take into account specifically the needs of vulnerable women and children who might be vulnerable to the violence and exploitation during their travels. But we also ask for the reception facilities and Frontex and Europol to have a very sensitive policy. And I also try to insert into the text references to the need to create reception structures which do meet the specific needs of women, so separate sleeping and sanitation opportunities for women and men. I wanted to carry on, but I have no time.
Mrs. García Pérez.
Thank you, Madam President. Now, we have faced various crises during the past years, the Euro crisis, economic crisis, the Greek crisis, but the refugee crisis, without doubt, is one which threatens to destroy the European project. It threatens its destruction because of how it could undermine solidarity, equality and justice. So we have to face the reality of hundreds of thousands of people crossing the Mediterranean, reaching the European Union, fleeing war, hunger, fear. And there's a part of this group that's even more vulnerable than the others, and that's women and girls. If we look at the AGNOR statistics, we see that 55% of the migrants reaching the EU are women and girls. These are women who have lost everything. They've lost their dignity. They have to sell their bodies in order to pay for the journey to reach the dream of Europe. There are women who are being raped. They are victims of the traffic smugglers. And we cannot resign ourselves. We cannot turn the other way. We must respond. We're talking about the dignity of the project of the European Union. We must implement integration policies. We must provide access to public services, health and education so that we can have these people integrated into our societies. I have no doubt that the solution to this problem is not to turn these people away and take them back to the other side of the Mediterranean. I have no doubt that the European responsibility lies in finding a solution to this problem and also to being capable to find a response to hundreds of thousands of people who harbor hope in Europe, and we are pushing them away. And this is nothing that this has nothing to do with the original European project.
Mrs. Atkinson, are you ready to answer? Yes. Mrs. Atkinson.
Thank you. We're at the same breakfast this morning celebrating International Women's Day, what I didn't hear from you when I raised the question that actually the Islamic values of these women coming in, I'm not talking about fundamental Islam, I'm talking about Islam across the Middle East. That is incompatible with our Western and your feminism and my feminism, which I think really differs. Shouldn't we be protecting our own women and children against the rapes and assaults that we have seen across the European cities before we start trying to integrate more? Because they don't integrate. They haven't integrated for 40 or 50 years.
I fully disagree with that statement. Islam is not incompatible with the European Union. The European Union is diverse. It's multifaceted. It's a continent of differences. There are European citizens who have this religion, but we see some radical statements which create a divide, not only through Islam, but any type of divide which creates a difference, for example, between men and women. Intolerance, injustice, that is what is really undermining the European Union. They are undermining the principles which we wish to champion in the European Union. The problem is not Islam. The problem is intolerance. The problem is the lack of solidarity. The problem is not being aware that this is our project for all of us.
I will give the floor to Mrs. von STORCH. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam President. We're talking here about a wish list from the Women's Committee for women asylum seekers in the EU. In the situation of crisis, we have to remain humane, and that is clear. The resolution calls for measures only for women. All refugees and migrants would simply be waved through, and I reject that for the following reason. Vice President Frans Timmermans said recently that 60% of the people who are coming to us are not refugees, and that we need to make a distinction between economic migrants and refugees. And this is something that the Women's Committee does not want to recognize. Attracting people and then locking them in sports halls and then making their future depend on some sort of a stamp on a document. So this is a wish list which far exceeds the remit of the Women's Committee, and which is not in line with realities, and for that reason, like with many other reports from that committee, we would reject it. Thank you very much, Mrs. von STORCH. There's a blue card for you from Mr. FRUNZULICÄ. Will you accept it? You have the floor, 30 seconds.
First of all, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to wishing to all our colleagues a beautiful life, a wonderful spring, lots of achievements, health and happiness for this beautiful day of 8th of March. Let's wish the same thing to all the women and girls of the world. And at the same time, allow me to ask you, don't you think so that, you know, all these women need better protection wherever they are, irrespective of their religion, ethnicity, and so on and so forth? Anyway, once again, happy day.
Sorry, you need to ask a question. Mr. FRUNZULICÄ, this was not a blue card. You could raise your wishes for Women's Day when you have the floor. Blue cards are for asking a question to the other speaker. Nevertheless, I have to give the floor to Frau von STORCH for 30 seconds.
Ja, eine wunderbare Frage. Und
yes, it's an excellent question, and it shows here that we've put this debate on Women's Day, and we see what level of interest is. The plenary is almost empty.
Die nächste Rednerin ist nun.
The next speaker for 2 minutes is Angelika MLINAR on behalf of the ALDE group. Thank you, President.
Report which is comprehensive and balanced. This is a great achievement, and it was possible only thanks to the very constructive spirit of the rapporteur, Madame Honeyball, and the majority of the shadows aimed at recognizing and protecting vulnerable women. Female migration is not a new phenomenon, but it is increasing, as is female refugees and migrants' vulnerability to human trafficking, exploitation, discrimination and abuse. However, some colleagues think that the best way to celebrate the 8th of March is to deprive women, refugees and asylum seekers, among other things, of sexual health and reproductive rights, and deny them the possibility for a faster and more efficient family reunification process. The division in the House is clearly showing that the challenge ahead is not a refugee crisis, but in fact it is a political crisis. In difficult times, gender equality and women's rights are often being neglected by organisations, decision makers and civil society, and considered as a detail or a luxury, or in fact a complication. When in crisis mode, it is more difficult to see the gender perspective, but it doesn't mean that we can tolerate that the EU is not protecting fundamental and human rights. Women seeking asylum do need specific support, since we do know that many reception centres are overcrowded, lack the adequate lighting and separate spaces for single women and families with children. I hope that this report will be perceived as a guideline for the work of the Commission and the Council in order to have a truly holistic approach, tackling also the causes of violence against women, including smuggling and trafficking, and integrating more women in peace processes in order to avoid and solve conflicts that are at the origin of every refugee crisis. Thank you.
Danke sehr.
Thank you very much. The next speaker on behalf of the GUE group is Mrs. Malin BJÖRK for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam. The 8th of March, International Women's Day, is a possibility to create visibility for the plight of women. We are very rightly focusing on the plight of women refugees. I'd like to focus on safe passage and family reunification this morning. Safe passage is incredibly important for women and young girls because they're particularly vulnerable. Safe passage is very important for this group of people. Closing borders has very severe consequences for these women, and I think it's an unacceptable solution. On family reunification, various countries have really undermined the principle of family reunification. This is something which is granted to families, to women and children in particular that are stuck in unsafe countries. It's very important for families to be able to reunite. I would agree with the report, and I lament that we are not able to combat racism in the same way.
For you from Ms. Winberg, do you accept it? Yes, you've got 30 seconds.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I regret that there are so many young migrant men who attack women, and that was the case in 2015 in Stockholm, and it also is something that happened in Cologne, and also that the police trying to hide this fact. How can we guarantee the security of Western women? How can we make it possible for Western women to be, how can we allow Western women to become victims of...
Thank you very much. Well, people are fleeing, and there are lots of untruths being bandied about. We need to make sure to have a cohesive society, and we must agree that their society is quite dark.
Now
Mr. Ernest Unneston for 1.5 minutes on behalf of the Greens.
Yes. Yesterday was a shameful day for the European Union. There are many women who had to bear the wind, rain and mud, whereas in the summit they decided to water down people's rights and to agree to collective expulsion, and this flying in the face of the law. I think this is an intolerable situation. Once again, we see how European governments are really overseeing a very dark period in the Union. We have the Honeyball report, which is to be up for vote. This is a slew of policies designed to protect women, refugees. I think it's high time for the European Union and their governments to listen to what we have to say. The only way to do away with rape, violence, extortion is to come up with proper policies. We need safe passage. This is the only way to deal with the situation. We need to have family reunification. Women need to, independently of their spouses, be able to apply for asylum. We need to provide special care for pregnant and nursing women. We need to combat this macho society. These are fundamental rights of women that are at stake, and please do listen to us at least this time. Thank you.
Gracias, señor Utterson. Hay una tarjeta.
Thank you very much. There's a blue card from Mrs. Atkinson. Will you accept, sir?
No, hasn't been accepted. So, the next speaker is for EFDD, Ms. Daniela AIUTO for 1 minute 30.
Thank you, President. Dear colleagues, we are called upon as citizens and as members of the European institutions to deal with this huge crisis, this huge migratory flux, and bringing millions to knock on the door of the old continent. And women and children are now the overwhelming part of this migratory phenomenon. It's not transitional, it's not temporary. We've got to, we need to change the demographic imbalance on our continent. The people who are fleeing violence in their own countries, gender violence, persecution, lack of values, but people are also migrating because of climate change and because of the misplaced exploitation, over-exploitation of the resources of this planet. And with these people, not just we are co-responsible. We are responsible as well for the situation of these people. And at the moment, women suffer the most because of the migratory phenomenon. What we've got to do, above all, is one thing: we've got to remain human. We have to show real solidarity. We have to give these people a dignified welcome, and we have to become aware of the real needs in all 28 member states. And that's the only way we can deal with this huge crisis, the crisis of a whole era. We can't get away from this crisis by shutting the gate, shutting your borders, and even you can't do it by paying countries like Turkey so that they can actually keep this problem a little bit further away from us. We think there's no time to be lost. What we have is an urgent need to find legal channels for access to Europe, more humane channels for access to Europe. No women would lose her own home, her own house, unless she saw mortal danger for herself and her children.
Sorry, blue cards from the same group, I don't take them. Sorry. So, okay, so I was told you were the same group. So, all right, do you accept the blue card from Ms. Atkinson? Ms. Atkinson? Yes. So you have 30 seconds.
Actually, one of the reasons I'm not in the same group as you, because of your approach to socialism and Greens en bloc. That's one of the reasons I actually left your group. You're not making the difference between economic migrants and those that are real refugees. And again, you seem to have a big difference within your grouping. Do you make the distinction between economic migrants and refugees?
Well, thank you for your question. that there isn't a difference if you're fleeing from a situation where there is death and war. Fleeing from a country where there's war, it's like running away from a country that doesn't give you the living, where you can't farm, or where you have dictatorships, where you can't live for those reasons. So just creating distinctions like that just creates division and confusion, and Europe doesn't need division or confusion. Thank you. The last speaker for the groups is Mrs. Mireille D'ORNANO on behalf of ENF. 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. I've just come back from Iraq, where during a humanitarian mission I visited persecuted Christians for decades. I have been fighting for women and their dignity in Europe, and I was stunned to discover the report by her. There can be no better illustration of this type of socialism, which is completely removed from where have you seen that women are asking for asylum on the basis of LGBTI status, and extending the criteria for refugee status to such vague criteria? You're running a risk of much more massive flows of refugees. How can you say what proof will be required of these claims? And I am saddened by the use that you're making of the persecution of women for your moral dictatorship.
Dear colleagues, we are now running out of time, I'm afraid. So there were blue cards allowed during this period when there were group speakers, but I'm not going to allow any more blue cards. I'm saying this straight away so that you're not disappointed if I don't take you. The next speaker now is Constance Le Grip, who has 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam President. The European Parliament would like to dedicate International Women's Day to the question of women refugees who are seeking asylum with the children who are accompanying them. In this House, there's no political group, there's no MEP, there's no human being who can be insensitive to the human plight of this group, and this is something that we see evidence of throughout Europe, in various European countries. We see the plight of women refugees seeking asylum, but we at the EPP, with regard to the Honeyball report, would like to introduce a motion of resolution for an alternate report, because we don't fully agree with the Honeyball approach. We would like to have an alternative motion for resolution which would bring forth dignified and humane solutions which are also responsible vis-a-vis women refugee asylum seekers. We would like to be realistic and reasonable in our approach. We would like to dovetail this with the specific needs to set up specific measures which are destined to vulnerable women, such as pregnant women, and which is a pragmatic and reasonable approach to the issue. We also wish to have a priority given to combating trafficking and sexual exploitation by smugglers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Mrs. Maria Arena for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. 1/3 of asylum seekers are women. 38% of migrants are women and children. 55% of those arriving in Greece today are women and children. The figures show the conditions which are very difficult conditions, the impossible conditions in countries of origin as a result of war and a situation of instability. But they also show us particularly that for women, gender-based violence is prevalent in these countries. And we had someone who came and told us about her situation, and the situation of women in these countries in general. The figures show us that we need to take into account the specific situation of these women. First of all, looking at gender-based issues in the refugee applications drafted by men for men, and they need to be reviewed. We need to take into account the needs of migrants, particularly the question of FGM. That's something which needs to be taken into account much more seriously. We also need to look at reception and also access to sexual and reproductive health, and abortion with which is risk-free, so that it is possible for these women to live in Europe. If we do nothing, history will record that Europe turned away from its values: humanism, solidarity, human rights. And that is what the report is calling for. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank Mary Honeyball for all of the work that she's done on the report.
Merci. Die nächste Redner.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mrs. Wiśniewska for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, what we hear about the situation of women refugees are appalling. And sometimes we see that they have to pay with their own bodies for the right to take the journey to Europe. During their journey, and also once they get to Europe, they are exposed to violence and lack of understanding. The very poor situation in the reception centers is conducive to more tragedies. And regardless of what we think about the entire crisis, we see that the situation requires a radical response which could improve the position of women and the fate of women in the European Union. Unfortunately, for yet another time, once again, the European Parliament is proving that it cannot stay at the level where we can be united, and uses every opportunity to impose the rights of sexual minorities and abortion and other issues. This is not about the problems which are the plague of women refugees. Thank you.
The next speaker is Mrs. Becerra Basterrechea, who has 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Commissioner, I'd like to thank you quite sincerely, and I would like to thank Mrs. Honeyball for her report, which is very thorough and comes at a very good time, because we see that there is a growing scope of this problem, and we see that the European Union needs to bring to the table the proper policy. We see some changes in the European Union migrant crisis. We see that we have to face a humanitarian crisis within our own borders, and the Commission has now bestowed 700 million euros to this issue. We see that many of the refugees arriving are women and children. And so we see the gender dimension of this massive displaced persons is a determining factor. Women and girls are particular victims of discrimination and violence, gender-based and sexual violence. Now, Mr. Tusk said that irregular migration is no longer an issue, but the desperate policies to freeze migration should not fly in the face of Article 18 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. We also have CEDAW, we have the Istanbul Convention, the Geneva Convention. We will be finally signing the Istanbul Convention. We must live up to the letter of it.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mrs. Kostadinka KUNEVA, who has 1 minute.
First of all, my best wishes to all working women who are still fighting for their rights. It seems that Strasbourg is not just separated by Brussels by 440 kilometers, but is separated by an abyss. We're here at the European Parliament discussing a report which is asking to protect women refugees in a humane way. At the same time, the European Council in Brussels says that Austria and other countries quite rightly closed down their borders, and some governments are now openly racist, are saying that they will not accept Muslims on the territory. What we ask for is safe and legal ways for refugees and migrants, and at the same time Council is going through some kind of inhuman trade-off with Turkey. So for each woman refugee which is granted asylum, you will have a woman migrant who will be obliged to return to Turkey. The UNHCR quite rightly says that such an agreement between the European Union and Turkey could be illegal because it infringes both international and European law. I call upon you not to become an accomplice in this. And let us support the...
Ms. Over, I cannot give you more time. I apologize, but that's the rule. So, die nächste Rednerin ist Frau...
The next speaker is Mrs. Terry Reintke, who has 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair, dear Commissioner, dear colleagues. More than 150 years ago, the black feminist Sojourner Truth, in her speech Ain't I a Woman, very clearly highlighted the shortcomings of parts of the struggle for women's rights that was excluding black women, working class women or lesbian women. Today in this debate, I am actually reminded of this very important point when we are discussing patriarchal violence and the fight against violence against women, and some parts of this Parliament apparently do not want to recognize the fact that many hundreds of thousands of the women that we are speaking about in the European Union are actually refugees themselves. The right side of this Parliament actually seems to divide between European women that deserve protection and the others that are not worthy of protection. I am very happy that the majority of this Parliament has understood Sojourner Truth's point. Women's rights are universal. They do not stop at national borders or religious or ethnic categorizations. With this report, I think we take a very important step not only to protect female refugees, but also to strengthen intersectional feminism in the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mrs. Margot Parker for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you. If the UK had sensible immigration controls, such as the Australian point system, we could do more to help genuine refugees and offer protection to those suffering persecution. But because we have 300,000 net people coming to Britain every year, the government tries to look tough to respond to legitimate public concern. So they make it more difficult for the people we actually need from the Commonwealth and those we should offer protection to, in favour of unlimited numbers of unskilled workers from Europe with no criminal background checks. It's cynical. It's disgraceful. Over 1 million people come to Europe in 2015. With both Chancellor Merkel saying anyone can come through the Qualification Directive, the EU is encouraging vulnerable women and children to make the deadly journey through the Mediterranean. This plays definitely into the hands of traffickers and causes the loss of life. Europol has said that 10,000 migrant children are missing, with many caught up in sexual exploitation. The EU has opened the door to millions of people from countries and cultures that treat women as second-class citizens and LGBTI people even worse. Is it any wonder we see the shocking scenes in Cologne and Sweden with women being sexually assaulted and humiliated? For the safety of our own women and for the welfare of those seeking refuge, we must scrap these EU policies and leave the European Union.
The next speaker is Mr. Buonanno for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. I'd like to read a few paragraphs. I don't want to be banal when talking about such an important issue, however. Be very careful not to make a woman cry, because God is counting that woman's tears. The woman comes from the man's rib. She doesn't come from his feet. She's not supposed to be trodden underfoot. She doesn't come from his head, and so she's not superior. But she comes from his side, from his ribs, so that she can be equal, a little bit lower than his arm, so that he can protect her. And on the side of the heart as well, so that she can be loved. for me, this brings together, this sums up what we should think and do, think about women and do for women. Less hypocrisy and more facts, more acts, fewer bunches of mimosa and more serious measures, and that Muslims should learn these things faster than we do. Thank you.
The next speaker is Mrs. GALL-PELCZ for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Commissioner, on International Women's Day we're talking about violence against women and migrant women. Undoubtedly, women and children fleeing war and persecution in the hope of a new and better life in Europe. It's a long and arduous journey during which they are exposed to violence and criminals. Of course, we're all sensitive to their problems, the problems of these women and children. We have important things to do, like provision of proper care, also proper housing for them. The EPP has put forward its own alternative resolution because we couldn't agree with the report. We believe that the rapporteur has gone beyond her mandate and has dealt with issues that are not within the remit of the FEM committee. Asylum, migration, family reunification was not really what we were supposed to focus on. We could have focused on lactating women or pregnant women and their special needs. This is a recurring problem. Instead of being able to help, we really demonstrate how we can go beyond the mandate and overreach our competences. This is the real obstacle to finding a solution. I ask you, colleagues, to support our motion for a resolution. Thank you.
The next speaker for 1.5 minutes is Maria Neukel. Dear colleagues, first of all, thank you very much to Mrs. Honeyball. This is an excellent report and is a good basis for us. We're talking here about the situation of women refugees. Women and men refugees have similar problems. They're cold, they suffer from hunger, they fear the same, they have concern for their future. This is something that men and women refugees experience in the same way. But women have additional hardships that they have to deal with. Often they are traveling with children and they may be pregnant as well. And they fled from countries where often they were threatened by or subject to violence. And their situation is difficult during the transit as well. They are subject to violence from the men in countries that they're transiting. And they pay, but they pay not only with money, but they pay with their bodies as well. And on International Women's Day, it's important for us to mention this, that they pay with money and also with rape. Girls as well, they pay for the next life jacket. We're all aware of this, and we know that women are paying a very high price when they're fleeing. And we have a specific responsibility to take into account the situation of women and children. The next speaker is Mrs. Julie Girling for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. No one chooses to be a refugee, and no one aspires to be an asylum seeker. No woman sets out on a journey that could lead to what is, for me, the most poignant and appalling outcome I have seen. That is, women having to separate from their children due to illness or violence. The immense suffering of women refugees is abundantly clear. We have a duty to protect them from violence and rape and to provide healthcare and sustenance. However, this report goes too far in some areas, particularly in finance and legal aid. So my delegation, the British Conservatives, will be supporting the EPP resolution, as this recognises the competences of this committee and of this Parliament. But I want to be clear that we appreciate the work of Mrs. Honeyball. We understand the sentiments, we understand the political thrust and support behind her report, and we will not vote against it.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mrs. WIKSTRÖM for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Not everyone is as lucky as we are to live in countries of peace and prosperity. I'd like to thank Ms. Honeyball for the work that she's done in her report. When we deal with such important issues such as share out of refugees in the member states, very often we overlook the humans behind the figures. This report is very sensible and well balanced. It talks about the challenges that women refugees encounter. Unfortunately, today I'm quite disconcerted by what the Conservatives in the European Parliament are aiming for. This is something which could actually aggravate the fate of the women refugees. Today is International Women's Day, and I think it's unfortunate to allow this oppression against women to continue. We cannot deprive them of basic care, especially after the sexual violence that they are encountering.
The next speaker is Mr. Stefan ECK for 1 minute. Thank you very much, colleagues. Today we're having a very tricky debate. If the Balkan route is not open, if the right are calling for the borders to be protected using violence and weapons. You cannot use weapons against women and children. There we'd be burying the European Europe has to demonstrate solidarity with the plight of women and children and open up the borders for them or keep them open. We need to respond to some of the comments made by the right. This is something that we owe to Europe. It is something that we owe to humanity. And this is what we must do to make progress in Europe. Thank you.
Die nächste Rednerin ist nur Frau Heidi.
And now, Heidi HAUTALA for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I would also like to join those who have extended thanks to Mrs. Honeyball for her very comprehensive work, and I do take note of the fact that some people feel that this has gone beyond the remit, but we must agree that women's rights are universal. When we look at the specific situation of women and the threats and dangers that they encounter, we must make sure that they are guaranteed the services that they need. And of course, there are services for reproductive health, which are something which is very germane to the fact that they are women. And I think we must acknowledge that we have to protect vulnerable groups, and women refugees are a specific important group.
The next speaker is Angelika NIEBLER for 1 minute 30. Chair, Commissioner, colleagues, I think it is a good thing that on International Women's Day we're talking about the situation of women refugees, but it's also good that we had an opportunity this morning to talk about the socio-economic situation of women, because a lot of what applies to women refugees and is being demanded in terms of protection for them is something that we have to ensure is guaranteed for all women. Violence against women is unacceptable. Attacks on women and girls, rapes need to be pursued with the full force of the law. It is important to have protection for victims. And secondly, I think it is important to ensure that human trafficking and smuggling is fought against, and that is not only something which applies to women refugees. We've dealt extensively with forced prostitution, and I think that we're all on the same line on that subject, and I hope that we will be taking a step forward with the outcome of the EU-Turkey summit, where legal avenues are to be found, and ensure that we have appropriate procedures. Thank you very much. And of course I will be supporting the alternative resolution from our group. The next speaker is Mr. Panzeri for 1 minute 30.
Grazie.
Thank you, President. Leaving aside the crazy things that I've heard this morning from the right wing and from the nationalists, we have to know that the response to the situation of refugees is actually going to be finding these answers is a test for Europe. It will determine whether we survive as the European Union, whether our values upon which the European Union is built survive as well. If you look at the Mediterranean, the Aegean Sea, what's dying there is also European dignity. The fact that we can't deal with this migratory flow means that we might end up actually causing our European project based on compassion and solidarity and justice to fail. The situation of women and children, the situation of migration, means that they are very vulnerable at all stages of their journey. Many women who arrive in Europe have been victims of sexual vices, they have been trafficked, they have been exploited in various ways, which leading to psychological trauma and stigmatization and shame. And so I think it's necessary that all member states sign and ratify the Istanbul Convention, which calls upon, which means that refugee status has to take into account gender dimensions and provide support, reception, which is gender sensitive, as set out in the Honeyball report. Today, European leaders have to show that they're able to have a far-reaching vision and looking into the future, a vision which is based on solidarity, and we have to have a policy which means that we can defend those who are most vulnerable, create the right sort of reception centres for them. We have a moral duty here, and I think our member state leaders need to shoulder that moral responsibility more than they are at the moment.
The next speaker is Arne Gericke for 1 minute. Thank you very much. When we're talking today about the situation of women refugees, and then a lot of people are talking about it. Looking at this from the German point of view, I'd say to Mrs. Honeyball, you need to look further than just your own situation before you come with the wrong premises. The UK has taken in 166 refugees from Syria. I'm not criticizing that, but don't overlook all of the thousands of people who are active in Germany working together with women refugees. Germany took on 1.2 million, and Greece and Italy have been taking in huge numbers. It's a huge European problem. It's a global issue. And I discussed this with some officials yesterday, and they were very clear. They said, go to a reception centre, see what's happening, help, and then you won't be coming up with these sorts of proposals. I will be supporting the EPP motion.
The
next speaker is Jordi Sebastian for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Commissioner, I'd like to congratulate Mrs. Honeyball for this very courageous report. It's very clear that women refugees are victims twice over. The case is very clear. We want to make sure that the European Council and the Member States and Commission will heed our words. But what we see is that the institution wants to close the door to refugees. I think we need to remember remember in 1939, not very long ago, Elizabeth Heidenberg, an activist in Elna, in Catalan, in southern France, set up a maternity to help women who were fleeing the Franco regime and who were in refugee camps. These women were dying of cold and infections, and these installations were there to receive these women. And there were other refugee women who were fleeing Nazi horror. We were refugees not long ago. Where is our historic memory? Where is our solidarity?
The next speaker is Anna Maria Corazza Bildt for 1 minute 30.
More and more asylum seekers coming to Europe are women and children. Often women are alone with their kids. Women and girls are at risk of trafficking, sexual exploitation and violence during their journey, but even when they are in Europe. Safety and privacy must be assured. Separate sanitary and sleeping facilities are essential. Access to health care, including reproductive health, must be granted to women in need. Detention of girls must be avoided. Safe places for children in reception facilities, while their mother are being interviewed for asylum, should be provided. Women have undergone trauma, need psychological and physical support. Madam Chair, we have common rule on asylum and trafficking. Now it is time for the Member States to implement them. Building capacity, ensuring training for police and other officials on gender-based violence is important to identify victims and increase protection and prevention. Children must be given access to education. For girls, school means empowerment and often also protection from violence, such as child marriage. Access to language training and work for refugee women is also key for equality and successful integration. Today, Madam Chair, on the International Women's Day, we should be able to tell women and girls arriving to Europe, fleeing war and violence, you are not alone. Europe means safety for them. Let's join forces to protect them and put their dignity at the center of our debate. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Colleagues, given the time constraints, I have to say two things. First of all, I won't be able to accept any more blue cards, and it's also not going to be possible to have the Catch the Eye session. Colleagues have spoken at length, and we have a guest speaker at 11:30, and so I do apologize, but I would ask for your understanding. The next speaker is Mrs. Christine Bonnefoy for 1 minute 30.
On the International Women's Day, let's think about these women refugees, women asylum seekers who are coming to Europe fleeing war and who are very vulnerable indeed. Their critical situation means that the European Union has to fully integrate gender dimension into its asylum policies. I welcome the excellent report from Mary Hannibal. She has set out very well in her report the measures that are indispensable to protect women and protect their rights throughout the asylum procedure. Many women are victims of sexual abuse and gender violence during their journeys, and it's often pitiless. And when they're unaccompanied minors, they run the risk of falling into the hands of human traffickers. We're very worried about what we see, and that means there has to be more EU-level cooperation to fight against human trafficking and migrant trafficking. We've got to stop. We must not allow women who are victims of violence and rape and children to be detained and held up at borders. That only increases and exacerbates the trauma they've already suffered. Finally, the European Union must pay particular attention to female and LGBTI asylum seekers. They are victims of extra victimization, extra violence because of their sexual choices, their sexual orientation. We need a specific approach to ensure proper reception and proper integration of these people under dignified circumstances in Europe. It's very regrettable that the European right is opposed to this text, which is crucial in order to shed light on realities which are often ignored. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Helga Stevens for 1 minute.
President, colleagues, despite the good intentions of the report, it really does fail, because we have to look at the situation in which women refugees find themselves. It's an excellent idea to plea for separate facilities for women in reception hubs, for women who are traveling alone or women who are traveling with children. We must combat rape and violence against women and children, but the true question is whether or not a policy of open doors is something which will make these situations disappear. We must provide help, but should we provide help just because women are women? What about the principle of non-discrimination? Another problem is that the report does not draw a distinction between those who are fleeing war and persecution and those who are economic refugees. Also, minors should not be detained. This is something that is said in the report, under no circumstances, but the speaker is cut off.
Okay. Pardon, Ihre Zeit war vorbei.
I apologize, but your time had expired. The next speaker is Mr. Christoforou for 1 minute 30.
Today we celebrate International Women's Day, but the message we should be sending as a European Parliament is that what we say today on this day of celebration should be implemented and should be turned into actions. This is an excellent initiative on this day to pay honor to women refugees, because in our minds right now we have all these refugee women who are hanging on the fences of shame to save their lives, their families, their children, of all women refugees who start on this long trip of life and death in order to avoid being killed during a war. All those women who are fighting the battle of all battles in order to survive the life of a refugee. Next to these women, we should also pay tribute to Greek women who, when faced with these fences of shame, build fences and walls of solidarity, of honor in Idomeni, on the islands, throughout the territory of Greece. And we should also pay tribute to the women of Cyprus today, because women from Cyprus are refugee women. They are the only European refugee women fighting to return to their homes after 40 years of occupation. So they are fighting and struggling to live with dignity. So the European Parliament should pay tribute to the only European Union refugee woman, mothers who for 42 years have been waiting to learn what the fortune of their children were.
Ruža Tomašić für 1 Minute.
Thank you. Statistics tell us that women and children account for 38% of the total number of asylum seekers in 2015. Although the propaganda machine has for months tried to convince us otherwise, the figures clearly show that we have accepted many more men of military age than women and children. I don't want to discriminate and say that only one gender should defend and liberate the towns and villages in Syria and Iraq. If the local men of military age won't do it, who will do it? Europeans, Americans? We can assist, but the greatest burden must be borne by the local forces. The rapporteur unfortunately has not learned anything from these figures and continues to promote the open borders policy and the loose asylum policy too. I think that it is improper, to say the least, to exploit the misery of the refugees and asylum seekers to promote abortion. I don't advocate closed borders, but I don't want to see our borders open without any question. Thank you.
The next speaker is Mr. Adam Seinfeld for 1.5 minutes.
Pani Przewodnicząca.
Thank you very much, Chair. Women and children who flee violence, brutal violence, live a history of horror and trauma. But we also see a great paradox here, because very often it is exactly what they are fleeing from is then standing on their path and encounters them even within the territory of the European Union. And this is why while I do understand the requests and requirements put within this report, I do not necessarily agree with all of them, but I feel that we should look at this paradox and see the reasons for its existence. It exists because very often in the member states, the religion, the tradition, the principles are put above and over and beyond the European law, or they are placed next to the European legislation, or it is being tolerated. And while it is the guests who need to comply with the laws and rules of the host, and not vice versa. And this is why we should be applying the rules of democracy and civil society, and we should apply them to all those who come to our continent as our guests. We also need to have all member states to sign the Istanbul Convention of the Council of Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And the last speaker is Mr. Tomáš ZDECHOVSKý for 1.5 minutes.
Děkuji, paní. Thank you, Madam Vice President, for the great pronunciation of my name. Dear Commissioner, when we say a refugee, most of us imagine a man 20 to 30 years old who comes to Europe risking his life in order to achieve his dream to live in welfare that the European society can provide to these people. There are few who realize that at the present time on Greek-Macedonian borders there are at least half of women and children among the refugees, and these are discriminated against in the process of admitting by authorities. They are constantly attacked by men. And these women set out on their journey more and more often, and we must react to this. Nevertheless, this report has a noble intention, and it is a pity that the European Parliament can't agree upon it. It has become another victim of another political fight. It has been misused to put in many things that have nothing to do with the present conditions of women in the European Union. I think that this is something that we must condemn. Therefore, I support the motion for resolution of the EPP that provides an alternative. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As I've already said, unfortunately we have no time left for the catch the eye procedure because we're going to have the UNHCR guest speaker on migration, on refugees. But I'll give the floor back to the Commissioner. You have the floor, Commissioner.
Madam President, honourable members, due to the fact that we have run out of time and I said all the important and essential information in my opening remarks, I'd like to limit myself to thanking you for your comments and discussion, and to reassure you again about the preparedness of the European Commission to do our best to bring all the efficient measures to make the life of vulnerables coming to EU with the refugees wave easier, and to reflect this in all our legislation and all our steps which will follow, be it Istanbul Convention, be it asylum procedures and other steps. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, and thank you also for keeping your remarks brief. Well, now we'll go back to the rapporteur, Mary Honeyball. 2 minutes.
We are relatively well off and relatively prosperous. Those refugees who feel that they have to leave their countries, their homes and often their loved ones to escape war and suffering are not in the privileged position that we are, and no one leaves home unless they really have to. And we know and we have heard during this debate that women refugees have very special requirements, which many of the speakers have pointed out. I would urge you all, therefore, to vote against the EPP resolution, which does significantly water down what is in my resolution about women refugees and their special needs. The EPP resolution waters down family reunion, which is an essential human right, aid for pregnant women, support for those women who have suffered violence, and childcare facilities, amongst other things. As has been said, women's rights are universal rights. The European Union has a long history of supporting women, and we must continue that. So therefore, please support my report in the vote today.
Thank you very much. That concludes this debate. The vote will take place today. We'll have a brief adjournment of session.
Darf Sie bitten, Platz zu nehmen?
Could you please take your seats?
Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren,
Ladies and gentlemen, before I reopen the session, I would just like to state that we are all deeply affected by the death of the Honduran human rights activist, Mrs. Cáceres. Mrs. Cáceres was a model for all of those who have struggled to protect the rights of the indigenous people in her country. Mrs. Cáceres was known to many of the members of this House at a personal level. She's worked with many of us over the course of the years, and therefore the European Parliament would like to condemn this event in the strongest terms, and we would encourage the government of Honduras to do everything in its power to catch the culprit or culprits behind this deed. We continue to support the activities of human rights activists around the world, and let's hope that this tragic event will not discourage other human rights activists, but rather strengthen them in their struggles. In Honduras, so many people have laid down their lives for this objective. I think all of those who knew Mrs. Cáceres will remember her. Dear Commissioner for the United Nations HCR, Mr. Grandi, ladies and gentlemen, today on the 8th of March, the European Parliament, as every year, is celebrating International Women's Day. But this year, lots of things are different. We find ourselves in the middle of the largest refugee and migration crisis since the end of the Second World War. Therefore, I think it is only natural, self-evident and logical that this particular 8th of March should be especially dedicated to the women who are most directly affected by this crisis. In February, the number of women and children coming to Europe overtook the number of men arriving. We all know that women are particularly vulnerable when they are escaping from their country. They are exposed to many, many dangers. We see that every single day, and we hear shocking reports every single day about discrimination, humiliation of dignity and rights, and the denial of many of the basic human rights. Conditions are getting worse and worse. Many people are stuck in camps and don't know whether they will get another chance to restart their lives. That's why, colleagues, the European Parliament would struggle against all forms of violence against women, whether this is during their escape or at their place of destination. I think that that is our duty. Many courageous women have fought for women's rights on our continent for over decades. I'm thinking particularly of the first president of this very House, Simone Weil. Just to name one single name from our own ranks. I'm very much aware that the heritage of these women cannot be reversed. To the contrary, but nothing is guaranteed forever. That's why the rights that have been achieved have to be defended anew every single day. That's why I'm very pleased that we have the High Commissioner for Refugees from the United Nations with us today, Filippo Grandi. High Commissioner, Mr. Grandi, you have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, thank you for welcoming me here. It is an honor for me to be with you today to mark International Women's Day and to speak about it from the perspective of the United Nations Refugee Organization. Honourable Members of Parliament, last month I was on the Greek island of Lesbos, where I saw the Hellenic Coast Guard bring in a boat it had just rescued at sea. The boat was carrying 200 people. Most were women with children, some of them very small, many elderly, and a few sick people. As they were disembarking, I spoke with several of them, and they told me stories of the conflicts they fled from in Syria or Afghanistan, the dangers of their journey and worries about what the future would bring. They were just one of many examples of today's global displacement crisis. Over 60 million people worldwide have been forced to flee. On average, 42,500 are forced to flee their homes every day. Half of them are women. Even though the vast majority of these uprooted people, 86%, are in other continents, Europe is now also seeing record numbers of refugees and migrants arriving on its shores. As you know very well, in 2015, 1 million people arrived in Europe, crossing the Mediterranean in unseaworthy dinghies and flimsy boats. We have all seen the images of the piles of discarded life jackets on the Greek beaches of those who survived the perilous journey. More than 3,700 people did not make it, a tragic testimony of our collective failure to properly address their plight. This year, to date, 138,000 refugees and migrants arrived in southern Europe. In public opinion, the image is often that of young single men arriving in Europe to look for work. Today, on International Women's Day, I wish to report instead that nearly 2/3 are women and children, up from last year's 41%. Take, for example, Fatima, who fled the war in Syria. She was found in a state of shock in the port of the Greek island of Samos. She was severely traumatized and injured. She had suffered violence at the hands of the man she had been traveling with. She was taken to a hospital for treatment, and there she revealed that her husband had entrusted her and their young daughter to a man she did not know to get her to a safe country in Europe. During this journey, the man confiscated all their travel documents, mobile phone and money. He abused Fatima and denied her direct contact with her husband. Fatima is just one of thousands of women and girls who are making the journey on their own, fleeing violence and persecution only to face a similar ordeal on their way to Europe, a place where they had hoped and expected to find sanctuary. Many desperate people worldwide view Europe as a safe and prosperous place that stands up for human rights and welcomes refugees. Most, for lack of better, safer alternatives, choose the services of smugglers at their great risk. Let me also be clear on an important fact that is often overlooked. The majority of the people arriving in Europe, 88%, come from the world's top 10 refugee-producing countries, chief among them Syria, Afghanistan and Iraq, but also Eritrea and Somalia. This has been and essentially remains a refugee movement. The number of women and children among them is increasing rapidly, as I have said, and many travel without male relatives. We also see a large number of pregnant women or women with babies and small children among the arrivals. A recent UNHCR study found that 20% of the Syrians arriving in Greece were families headed by women without husband or father. Just as Fatima, these women and children are exposed to abuse and sexual violence at the hands of unscrupulous smugglers, or are at great risk when they travel along insecure routes, having to stay in places that lack basic security, such as parks, bus or train stations, or at the roadside. In Greece, we have seen a rapid build-up of stranded refugees and migrants, currently over 35,000. Who, as a result of border closures in the Western Balkans, have been denied access into the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. This has had a direct impact on women and girls who are suffering disproportionately and are at great risk of sexual exploitation and trafficking. We at UNHCR, with our partners, support local authorities in all affected areas to improve reception conditions and to provide assistance to people in need. We have taken measures to reduce risks and help women along the way. Many reception areas and transit points now have separate facilities for women and children. Together with UNICEF and the International Committee of the Red Cross, we have set up 20 child and family support hubs. These hubs, also known as Blue Dots, provide a safe place for women and children where they can find all available services and information about their options in a single location. The hubs aim to help vulnerable women and children on the move and mitigate the risks of trauma, violence, exploitation and trafficking. However, honourable members of Parliament, we need more than a humanitarian response. On other continents, countries with far less means than Europe have been responding to much larger movements of people forced to leave their homes and continue to do so. In this very chamber, exhortations to states around the world to treat refugees according to principles and in an organised manner have resonated many times. Such exhortations now apply to Europe. This emergency does not have to be a crisis. It can be managed. As you know, yesterday, the European Union head of states and government met with Turkey on the onward movement of refugees and migrants to Europe. We were not party to these conversations and understand that discussions on the details are still ongoing. But as a first reaction, I am deeply concerned about any arrangement that would involve the blanket return of anyone from one country to another without spelling out the refugee protection safeguards under international law. An asylum seeker should only be returned to a third state if the responsibility for assessing the particular asylum application in substance is assumed by the third country. The asylum seeker will be protected from refoulement, and if the individual will be able to seek and, if recognized, enjoy asylum in accordance with accepted international standards and have full and effective access to education, work, health care and as necessary social assistance. These safeguards would need to be set out legally and would need to govern any mechanism under which responsibility would be transferred for assessing an asylum claim. Pre-departure screening would also need to be in place to identify heightened risk categories that may not be appropriate for return, even if the above conditions are met. Turkey is already hosting nearly 3 million refugees. And it is important for the international community to share this responsibility more widely. We welcome, of course, Any initiative that promotes regular pathways of admission for refugees in significant numbers from all neighbouring countries in the region, not just Turkey and not just Syrian refugees, to third countries. We hope that this will happen and that it will apply also to other countries in the region that host a considerable number of refugees, such as Lebanon and Jordan. In fact, UNHCR has been calling on states to increase the different legal routes for the admission of Syrian refugees so that they do not have to resort to people smugglers and to dangerous journeys. These pathways include resettlement, humanitarian admission, private sponsorship, refugee-friendly family reunion, as well as student scholarships and labour mobility schemes. A key opportunity to advance these solutions for Syrian refugees will be on March 30th in Geneva, when UNHCR will convene a high-level meeting on global responsibility sharing through pathways for admission of Syrian refugees. States will be invited to pledge concrete commitments. We hope that up to 10% of the Syrian refugee population in the region, which currently stands at 4.7 million, can benefit from these pathways. I still believe that to properly address the flow of refugees and migrants in Europe, we need a coordinated European response based on solidarity, political leadership, and the sharing of responsibilities to stabilize the situation and manage the movement of people more effectively. Last Friday, we presented a set of practical proposals to the European Union and its member states that would help achieve that. These proposals remain valid. They focus on improving registration and referral processes, including the relocation schemes within Europe. It remains imperative that relocation works and that the necessary places are made available. With the support of the European Commission, for which we are grateful, we also need to boost the emergency response capacity in Greece. UNHCR is on the ground with its partner, working closely in support of the Greek authorities. Finally, and looking forward, we must build on the lessons we have learned. It is crucial to strengthen compliance with and uphold the standards of the common European asylum system, even in times of emergency. It is of paramount importance to prevent further suffering and loss of life, to strengthen protection safeguards for people at risk, in particular women and unaccompanied children. This includes improving search and rescue operations, developing coordinated systems to protect and help unaccompanied children, and establishing measures to prevent and respond to sexual and gender-based violence. We need a new approach to develop an effective European asylum system, not only to manage the current refugee and migrant movement, but also for the future. We have to ensure that member states located at the external borders of the European Union will not continue to bear the disproportionate burden in addressing immediate reception needs. The solidarity that is so essential today for Greece and Italy may be well required for other states in the future. Honourable members of Parliament, next week the conflict in Syria will enter its 6th year. More than 4.7 million people, as I have said, have sought asylum in the region. 6.5 million people are internally displaced. Inside Syria, it is estimated that 13.5 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance, including 4.5 million in hard-to-reach areas. With the cessation of hostilities now holding for 10 days, the United Nations organizations, including UNHCR, have been able to deliver some much-needed humanitarian aid to people who have suffered years of war and deprivation. Meanwhile, in the neighbouring country, despite the generosity of host governments and communities, Syrian refugees are facing increasingly difficult living conditions after 5 years in exile. A recent study we conducted with the World Bank found that in Jordan and Lebanon, 90% of the Syrian refugees are living under the national poverty line, as they have little access to legal work, and many by now have depleted any resources they had brought with them. At last month's London conference, the international community pledged €10 billion for activities that help the refugees, that are meant to help the refugees and the host communities in improving education and livelihood opportunities. States must now honour the pledges made at the conference. This is very urgent. We cannot afford any more delay in stabilising the refugee and host communities in the region, and we need to take advantage of the window of opportunity given to us by the cessation of hostilities in Syria. But Syria is not the only country in the region beset by violence. In 2015, the escalation of violence in Iraq resulted in waves of new displacement. During the last 2 years alone, nearly 3.3 million people have been displaced across the country. 16% of the people arriving in Europe today are from Iraq. And after more than 3 decades, Afghans remain one of the largest refugee populations in the world, with some 2.6 million registered refugees. The vast majority of them live in Pakistan and Iran. An upsurge in violence in the second half of 2015 caused significant levels of displacement inside the country and across the border, including many unaccompanied children who try to reach Europe. Today in Afghanistan, 31 out of 34 provinces are affected by conflict, with more than 1 million people registered as internally displaced, an increase of 78% compared to last year. 25% of the people arriving in Europe are Afghans, and many have urgent protection needs. Elsewhere in the world, conflict continues to disrupt lives and uproot people. Our refugee programs in Africa remain severely underfunded, while the number of wars and displaced people increases rapidly. Northern Nigeria, the Central African Republic, South Sudan and Burundi, just to name a few. The Horn of Africa remains the theatre of multiple displacement situations, especially Somali refugees. In many of the protracted displacement situations in Africa, however, we can hardly give the refugees more, and even sometimes we give them less than the bare minimum to survive, and in many countries they are not allowed to work legally, so they remain dependent on very scarce aid. In Southeast Asia, in the Bay of Bengal, more than 33,000 refugees and migrants, mostly Rohingya and Bangladesh nationals, took to smuggler boats last year. Many died, the majority not from drowning, as we see in the Mediterranean Sea, but from abuse at the hands of people smugglers, abandonment and disease. And we also have a very specific refugee crisis in Central America, where thousands of Salvadorians, Hondurans and Guatemalans are fleeing deadly transnational gang violence. And again, International Women's Day is an opportunity to remember that most of them are women and children. They use the traditional migration routes going north to find safety in the future, but many are indeed refugees, fleeing violence, extortion and persecution. In a world riddled with conflict, mass population movement is a reality. Building fences and walls to keep people out is not a solution. It will only increase the suffering of the people who have already suffered the unimaginable. And women everywhere are among the most exposed. In the face of massive displacement and arrivals, very often the first reaction of politicians is to resort to scaremongering, manipulation of public opinion, and inciting hate against those who are different are unacceptable. A real response can only be based on solidarity and human rights, on responsibility sharing and respect for international law. Today we celebrate the many achievements we have made on the road to gender equality and the participation in women in social, economic and political life. since International Women's Day was first observed in 1975. It is also a moment to think about the long way ahead to reach full parity. But it is equally a day on which to reflect on the fact that discrimination and exclusions because of ethnicity, religion and gender are among the main root causes of conflict and persecution and ultimately of forced displacement. In 27 countries, for example, women still do not have the same rights as men to confer their nationality to their children. Many of the women arriving in Europe come from these countries, including Syria and Iraq. That means that if the fathers are missing, or there is no proof of paternal descent, their children will not have a nationality and are at risk of becoming stateless. This may affect access to health care and education and affect their ability to return home when conditions allow. Honourable members of Parliament, as we have said and heard countless times in the past 25 years, there are no humanitarian solutions to the political problems that are the root causes of massive forced displacement. There are no humanitarian solutions to the intractable wars, the upsurge in violence and the oppression and lack of governance in many parts of the world. We need political leadership and action both to resolve the conflicts that cause displacement and to make sure that people like Fatima and her little daughter can find the protection and safety they need without having to resort to criminal networks and smugglers who abuse and exploit them. These are not abstract concepts about which to make abstract statements. They are real, brutal facts which only courageous political leadership and considerate, forward-looking decisions based on international cooperation, respect for human rights, solidarity between states and a renewed sense of humanity can counter and redress. Europe is facing a moment of truth. This is the time to reaffirm the values upon which it was built. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grandi. On behalf of the Commission, Mr. Avramopoulos will take the floor.
Dankeschön, Herr Präsident. Dear High Commissioner, let me start by thanking you for the wake-up call regarding the situation of women migrants. It's the day today. Honourable members of the European Parliament, the sheer number of people arriving on Greek shores and through the Western Balkans, and the numbers we read daily in the press risk making us forget that these are individuals and human beings, many of them vulnerable and in need of protection. Many women travelling alone despite the dangers they are facing, many mothers risking their own and their children's lives. Let me assure you that the European Commission does not forget and does not forsake its humanitarian duties. Yes, we have to take control of the flows, make them more manageable and lower them. Yes, we need to better manage our external borders for the European Union, for the Member States and its citizens, but also for the people arriving. Yes, we need to stop the business of smugglers, also with the help of Europol, that send people by thousands every day to a possible death. Instead of dangerous routes, it is our responsibility to create more legal pathways for people in need of protection to be able to come to Europe directly, legally and safely. That is why I continue to call on Member States to not only deliver on their resettlement commitments made in July last year and for the Turkey humanitarian admission scheme, but also to commit to more and soon. All irregular migrants who arrive through Turkey will be returned to Turkey in accordance with European and international law. For those people who are already here, we need to improve the situation. That's why we have proposed a humanitarian assistance scheme to be used within the European Union. That's why we urgently need to proceed to large-scale relocations and why we need to further develop reception capacities. And in all of these things, the UNHCR is our steady and quintessential partner, and I look forward to continue to working closely together with Filippo Grandi, a person, a man, a personality who has come to lead the UNHCR in the midst of the refugee crisis, but he is a veteran, I would say, on these issues. He is a man of commitment to the cause of refugees, and I count very much on his invaluable help. Let me therefore once again welcome the close cooperation that we have established with UNHCR, and let me express my strong appreciation of the work done by UNHCR in the current crisis. UNHCR support is highly valued in and outside Europe. The European Commission and UNHCR work closely together to help Italy, and especially Greece, in accommodating and relocating migrants, but also in resettling them from outside. Together with the UNHCR, we need now to ensure a quick implementation of the voluntary humanitarian scheme from Turkey and to implement projects that will further improve the situation of the Syrians in Turkey. As you well know, our actions are not limited to the borders of Europe. The fact that over 60 million people are refugees or internally displaced across the globe reminds us that we should not lose sight that migration is not a European one only, it is a global challenge. Everyone in the international community should take its part of responsibility. All developed countries across the world should respond to the call of the United Nations for resettlement from their affected regions. The pledging conference organised by UNHCR on the 30th of March will be the next opportunity. And we need all together to reflect on how to positively address the phenomenon which characterises our era, our world, people's mobility. A phenomenon which is expected to increase for many different reasons, to take different forms, to be directed in different routes. We cannot ignore people's mobility. We cannot deny it, neither stop it. We need to prepare ways to respond to it without destabilising our societies, but on the contrary, by turning it into a two-way opportunity for the hosting countries and the migrants. We believe, therefore, that it is Europe's duty and its interest to support key partners managing the migratory flows and addressing the root causes of the displacements. Dealing with the global migration crisis requires, therefore, solid partnerships, enhanced cooperation and coordination with third countries and with regional and international organisations. In other words, it needs a global strategy. In a multifaceted and complex refugee crisis like the one of today, there cannot be a one-size-fits-all approach, and it cannot be the responsibility of just one country or one stakeholder. We all need each other, and we need to work together. That is why the relationship and collaboration between the European Union and the UNHCR is of utmost importance. A lot of work awaits us in the coming days and months, and we are all ready and committed to do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Avramopoulos. For the EPP, Mr. González Pons will take the floor.
Señor Alto Comisionado, el día...
High Commissioner, the International Women's Day is not just about rights, it's about facts. There should be equality, but there isn't. That's a fact. In a lot of countries around the world, women have less rights. That's a fact. In Europe, according to law, women have the same rights and status, but not in reality. That's another fact. It's very important to defend the equality of women in International Women's Day here today. Now, a lot of people discuss whether there should be an International Women's Day at all, but there are millions of reasons and millions of facts that justify this International Women's Day. There are millions of girls who don't go to school just because they're girls. There are millions of women who earn less for the same job just because they're women. There are old women, grandmothers who suffer, who don't get the same pensions, who don't have the same rights, women who are beaten, humiliated, abused just because they are women. And a lot of these women are poor, even here in Europe. We're talking about 3,500 women who die because they are murdered by their partners, by men. We're talking about 8 every day, 8 today. Women who are facing sexual assault throughout their life. Now, of course, we have better intentions than the Taliban, but unfortunately, when we look at the facts, the situation is still very problematic. We have heard about women refugees, the most vulnerable. They're fleeing war, they're fleeing a macho culture. They have to flee with their children. They are then often forced into sexual exploitation. They have causes to flee, such as rape being used as a weapon of war, female genital mutilation. And we saw 50% of those who drowned in the Mediterranean Sea were women and children. This is a very serious humanitarian crisis. The stories we hear are less and less humane. Putting in place barriers to stop women and children coming in. This dehumanizes us. A society that cannot feel pity for a woman begging for asylum with her baby. That is a society without a heart. It's an inhumane society. Being a woman, being born a woman, should be a blessing. Ensuring the rights and freedoms of women, making that a fact, ensuring that they are actually equal to the rights and freedoms of men is a duty. It is a challenge, not just for today, but for all of our lives, if we really want to call ourselves Europeans with any type of dignity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. González Pons. Now for the S&D group, Mrs. Guillaume.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Everyone now, I hope, understands that in the humanitarian crisis context, women refugees, ever more of them, are a particularly vulnerable group. On the day of the International Day of the Rights of Women, and thanks to your presence here today, High Commissioner, we are drawing attention to the conditions of life and survival, in fact, for these women. Can I think of Rayen, a young Syrian. I've never been able to sleep in the camps. I was too afraid someone would touch me. There were men and women everywhere. I was the object of violence. Women can't really complain, and they can't do anything which would disrupt their chances of getting there. And that's what Amnesty International saw, a woman in Syria, but it could have been Iraq or in other places where endemic violence applies. And it also applies here in Europe. They have been fleeing the horrors of war in their countries of origin, and they continue to live, to be afraid of assault throughout their travel. And we have to attach more importance to gender. there have been cases, and we've been able to put things into perspective, but it's still not enough. As Mireille D'ORNANO has said, special attention to migrant women has to go from start to finish, from the asylum procedure itself, and also conditions of reception, and also integration procedures as well. And that means that people have got to be trained at every step of the way, separate sanitation, separate sleeping quarters as well. And Ren was telling us about things happening in Europe, and we cannot have summit after summit without getting effective and collective action to tackle the humanitarian and moral crisis currently facing Europe. There are solutions. Reinforcing legal routes to get to Europe is perhaps the best way to fight the traffickers and smugglers who continue to enrich themselves. Proper cross-European solidarity to share out the burden and responsibilities. Relocation from Greece and Italy, currently taking place, 600 I think, must have political will behind them, and those numbers must increase. We're waiting patiently the Commission's proposal on the revision of Dublin, and we hope that that revision will lay the foundations for a proper policy going forward. We need an asylum system across Europe so people can apply for asylum, and it's not like a postal code lottery. We must work with countries of source, of origin, of transit and destination, so that obligations under human rights are respected. The EU-Turkey is recent in our memories, and this message is particularly important now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Guillaume. On behalf of the ECR group, Mr. Kirkhope will take the floor.
President, High Commissioner, Commissioner, as the UK Minister responsible for resettlement during the Bosnian crisis, I saw firsthand just what war does to a country, to its people and their hopes for the future. And I'm proud to be from a Europe that does not turn its back on the rest of the world. But the sad truth is that when some European leaders opened their doors last year to everyone seeking a better life, it merely pushed the most desperate, the most vulnerable and the most in need to the back of an already very long queue. To truly help those people most in need, I've long believed the solution is direct resettlement from conflict regions. It reduces pull factors, it prevents the tragic loss of life at sea, it reduces the demand for human trafficking, and it helps stabilise our external borders. If the EU is to continue offering a Europe of opportunity, sanctuary and community cohesion, then the EU must realise that resettlement and controlled immigration flows must be the solution. High Commissioner, as rapporteur for the permanent relocation mechanism, I would like to try and link that proposal with an ambitious UNHCR-led resettlement programme with the EU. Relocation in its current form is simply not working. Let's be truthful with each other. Some member states feel as though the system was forced on them, and migrants only want to go to certain member states. It is not a recipe for a long-term successful system. Member states will not support relocation in a meaningful way until the external borders are secure, the flow of migrants is stabilised, and we start to have a sense of the numbers we ultimately need to relocate. Keeping Europe's borders open with no clear plan or end in sight will only exacerbate the situation. We talk about safe legal routes to Europe. Resettlement achieves that. It helps ensure safe passage, especially for women and children, to whom you have referred eloquently today, taking them out of the hands of evil human traffickers. Too many female refugees are facing exploitation. Too many unaccompanied minors are tragically unaccounted for today. Europe could offer more Syrians, more women and more children refuge if we could get control of this crisis. To put in place a fair and controlled immigration system does not mean you lack compassion, but simply ensures that you can give genuine refugees the safety, the stability and the opportunities they truly deserve.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Kirkhope. For the Liberal group will be Mrs. WIKSTRÖM.
Mr. President, and thanks to you, Mr. Grandi, for your statements. You have taken up the post as High Commissioner
at a time where this continent has not seen as many refugees approaching our shores as we do today, in a couple of generations. The refugee crisis has followed on a financial crisis, and we can see how it still challenges the perception of our commitment to provide international protection for those entitled to the same. We tend in Europe to forget that we are living ever longer, and despite all of our troubles, we are still the richest continent on the planet. In this context, the very core of the global asylum system is currently being questioned by people that would prefer that the right of asylum was not an imperative right of an oppressed individual, but rather a kindness to be extended or not by the different 28 member states. I fear that in today's world, where states could choose whether to help refugees or not, a lot of people in need would be left without protection, with irreversible tragic consequences as a result. A cynical approach where the rich West dumps the challenges associated with receiving refugees on developing third countries in order to sit back, to hide behind walls, maybe sending a check every once in a while to pretend to care, is not a EU that I wish to contribute to. And as the spokesperson on migration for the Liberal and Democrat group and the rapporteur for this House on the upcoming revision of the Dublin regulation, I can only extend to you, High Commissioner, a clear message that Liberals and Democrats in Europe will always stand up for the right to asylum. And where some people in this chamber will pretend that the choice is an either-or, whether you either support the UNHCR or support the fundamental individual right of asylum, we will stand strong together with you and explain that you need both elements for the system to work. And by the way, the UNHCR should be getting a lot more support, not least financially, from this EU. We are living in challenging times, but let's realize that this continent has never been in a better shape to manage these challenges. You can count on my support and the support of my group for invaluable work, and I look forward to cooperating with you in days to come, as I did with your predecessor. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the GUI group, Mrs. Björk will be taking the floor. Thank you very much. The UN and the UNHCR are key to maintaining respect for international asylum law. That's why it's particularly important that you've come to speak to us today. I think it's actually a shame that you haven't been called upon to take on further tasks as part of the EU solution to the refugee crisis. Well, what's the wider perspective? Yes, there's a global refugee crisis, but we don't have a refugee crisis here in Europe. You said very intelligent things, important points. Women refugees' rights in particular need to be strengthened. And I hope we will be voting in favour of a very good report later on today. The EU needs to take in more people, and we need to do it in such a manner that we divide the responsibility among countries. Closed borders are not the right policy. There needs to be safe passages. We agree with you there. We need to be helping unaccompanied minors better as well. We need to improve our integration systems. I was in Calais yesterday. The situation that I witnessed yesterday is not in line with human rights. Please, come to Calais, have a look at the situation there. You said we need to combat Islamophobia and racism in Europe. We totally agree with you there. Last but not least, we can't leave Greece to become a refugee camp. We have to take joint responsibility. Mr. Grandi, the way the EU is now trying to negotiate with Turkey to keep refugees out does not reflect your proposals one bit. They are sending refugees back in the same boats that they came in. That is not in line with international asylum law. Thank you very much for pointing that out and drawing attention to it. With great concern, we see that the EU is not standing up for asylum right. I hope that your pressure on the EU will have effect. Thank you very much. For the Green Group, Mrs. Harms will be taking the floor.
High Commissioner, colleagues, I think the applause at the end of your speech showed that we are very pleased to have you here with us today to address us as European Parliament and to remind us of the urgent situation for women and children within this global refugee crisis. I think it's very good that you have given us these examples to raise our awareness, and also these striking figures that show that we're dealing with a global problem here. As members of the European Parliament, I think the majority of us at least are shocked that within the EU it has become so difficult to implement the Geneva Refugee Convention and asylum rights. The Union is made up of countries, but we have a responsibility to take those who come from catastrophes and wars and disasters. We are shocked when we remember the past. It seems that states are simply not in a measure to tackle this crisis anymore. So I think your speech is one that should all give us a wake-up call when we look at what was discussed yesterday with Turkey in the Turkey-EU summit. I think it's very clear that things are not being dealt with in the right way. One in, one out. What is that exactly? I think this is something that should shock us, bearing in mind the speech that you've just given us. We need to have a proper agreement on resettlement. We have such a small, narrow approach when dealing with such a wide problem. I think you've made it very clear to us that Europeans as a whole have not taken on board the true dimensions of this crisis. They're still trying to protect themselves from the oncoming catastrophe, and in this way are actually just making this disaster even worse. Thank you very much. It's a little bit difficult to speak here with all the noise.
Mrs. Harms, you're entirely correct there. Ladies and gentlemen, please would you take your seats? Just a minute, Mr. Paksas. Colleagues, please take your seats. This does not look like a debate. This looks like a football stadium just before the kickoff. That is not appropriate in the middle of a debate, so please sit down. I will not continue this debate until all of the colleagues have sat down. It makes absolutely no sense to proceed. That is not appropriate for the debate we're currently holding.
Natürlich nur ein Zufall, dass das überwiegend Männer sind, die.
Well, I know it's just a coincidence that it's mostly men who are standing up and chatting. Mr. Paksas, you have the floor.
Mr. President, colleagues, Mr. High Commissioner, well, I'm very happy to see you here. I hope that Europe will eventually manage to put everything in place, and we will realize that that member states need to help refugees and not have to open their cities for all migrants. Community in Europe is having to face with the actions of our politicians. And the situation will become even dire if we only get involved into discussions. And there is no need to discuss the things which are self-obvious. Of course, help humanitarian aid for war refugees and persons who are fleeing from their home because of political prosecution. And then others who seek better life in Europe. You, High Commissioner, do not have to accept at your home everyone, the guests you have not invited. Why should European citizens have to behave differently? So let's stop discussion and try to act. Help protect Europe from migrants. We need to protect our external borders better and not buy the support of Turkey for billions. We need to ensure safety of our people, and we need to displace and resettle people throughout different states. That's not the main thing we have to do. We need to fight the root causes of wars and conflicts. We need to help people who need support, but above that, we need to fight the root causes. And it looks a bit strange when for a few years we see villages burning in one or another states, and when those villages are burned down, we try to help those who manage to flee, whereas there are among those people more those who have never suffered from any fire or conflict.
On behalf of the ENF group, it will be Mr. Salvini.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. Well, how much hypocrisy have we heard at the expense of women today? I must say it's shocking. We're talking about inviting Turkey to Europe. The Prime Minister said putting men and women on the same level is counter to nature. The Vice Prime Minister said women should not laugh or provoke people in public. So, do you think that Europe should be bringing in people like that? I'm afraid that's just shameful. People who think that women should not be provocative or laugh in public? What kind of a country are we talking about? Turkey doesn't respect civil rights. It should never be a member of Europe, from my point of view. Well, 3 billion, why don't you give them to the unemployed in Europe? Not to the Turkish government to close newspapers and reopen them as they see fit. Give them to the women refugees, give them to Italy. The numbers say, High Commissioner, that 80,000 requests for asylum were entered in Italy. Only 5% were actually accepted as political refugees. 5%. 2/3 of the requests were rejected. You're talking about women, but in Italy, in January 2016, 7,000 requests for political asylum, women are less than 10%. They're all strong adult males. Syrians under 30. You don't see any Syrian women. It seems that we're financing an uncontrolled Islamic invasion of our country and our continent. So then my question is this. How much does it cost? How much does the UNHCR cost? How much do you cost? How much do the staff cost? How much of the 7 billion in your budget actually gets to the refugees? And how much ends up maintaining your hotel and office expenditure? We are paying people to stay in 5-star hotels. Well, Italian women are having trouble, they're unemployed.
Das Wort hat jetzt der
On the behalf of the non-attached members, Mr. Fontoulis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grandi. You're the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. But as reality would suggest, you're not doing your job very well. It's not your fault, perhaps, entirely. But it's a responsibility which is shared by others in the United Nations. Those who did not respond to the colonial aspirations of the Western forces, who have been bombing countries in Syria, Iraq, Libya, half of Africa, Ukraine has also been affected. And the big multinationals have been exploiting the cheap labour of millions from underdeveloped countries in order to put gain before anything else. And we think of privileged partners, and we've just seen a summit in Brussels. Turkey is protecting the smugglers, the terrorists and others besides. You should be taking immediate action in order to put out douse the flames in the Middle East, so that refugees can go home and get growth and development in their home countries. I think that we need to talk to those in the countries of origin, transit and destination, but what we don't want to get is a kind of multi-culti soup which is going to be lapped up by the multinationals who are simply looking for their own benefit from cheap labour. We are confusing humanity and humanitarianism with impunity, and sadly Greece, for example, has been hard hit by crisis already and is being turned into an open-air detention camp. We need solutions, and we need them now, and it does seem that you're not able or not willing to provide them. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. High Commissioner. In parliamentary democracy, anyone can express their opinion here in this House. The last two speeches that you've just heard are in no way representative of what this House feels.
Füge hinzu.
And I could add, I'd like to add, High Commissioner, High Commissioner, the European Parliament would like to warmly thank you High Commissioner, I'd like to add, just wait a minute. High Commissioner, I'd just like to say that we would like to warmly thank you for your presence and for the excellent speech that you held.
Bitte, Herr Coburn, Sie... Herr Coburn. Bitte, Herr Coburn, Sie haben sich zu Wort gemeldet.
Mr. Coburn, you're asking for the floor.
Bitte, Herr Coburn, Sie haben sich zu Wort gemeldet.
Dankeschön, mein President. I'd just like to ask you, I thought as the president of this august body, aren't you meant to be neutral? Should you be siding in a partisan way with the people on this side of the House, sir. Are you not?
Bitte. Sind Sie fertig? Sind Sie fertig?
Have you quite finished?
President, I think you should remain neutral in these regards. In the House of Commons, your behaviour would be unconscionable. The Speaker of the House of Commons cannot take sides.
Vielen Dank. Herr Coburn. Herr Coburn, der
Now, Mr. Coburn, you've got the High Commissioner from the United Nations. He's the honoured guest, a guest of honour in our plenary session. And I'm hearing racism and unacceptable remarks. I just can't stand that myself. So I just can't leave it there, I'm afraid.
Good afternoon, colleagues. The sitting is now resumed and we come to the votes. There are a great number of votes, so I would ask that we all cooperate to allow a smooth running of the session. The first report is the Selimovic report. We have one amendment which I put to the vote by roll call. The vote is now open. Has everyone voted? The vote is now closed. And that is rejected. The Act is now definitively adopted in accordance with the agreement reached between Parliament and the Council. We move to the Tarabella report, which I now move Amendment 1. Those in favour? Against? Abstentions? And that is adopted. The Commission proposal in favour? Against? Abstentions? And that is adopted. The legislative resolution by roll call. The vote is open. Has everyone voted? The vote is now closed. And that is adopted. We move now to the Fleckenstein report and Amendment 148 by roll call. The vote is now open. And the vote is closed. And that is rejected. We move to a number of amendments from 1 to 135. You can see them on your voting list. Those in favour, please. Against? Abstentions? I'm going to check that vote, please. So I'll open the vote for a check. I now close that vote. And that is well adopted. It is my eyesight, colleagues. Amendment 41 by roll call. The vote is now open. The vote is closed. And that is adopted. Amendment 98 in favour? Against? Abstentions? Adopted. 99 in favour? Against? Abstentions? Adopted. 146 by roll call. The vote is open. And the vote is now closed. And that is rejected. Amendment 139 by roll call. The vote is open. And the vote is closed. And that is rejected. The committee amendment 44 in favour. Against. Abstentions adopted. Amendment 140D in favour. Against. Abstentions rejected. Amendment 141D in favour. Against. Abstentions rejected. Amendment 150 by roll call. The vote is open. And the vote is now closed. That is rejected. 137 by roll call. The vote is open. And the vote is closed. And that is rejected. Amendment 142 by roll call. The vote is open. And the vote is now closed. And that is rejected. Amendment 48 in favour. Against. Abstentions adopted. 154 by roll call. The vote is open. The vote is closed. And that is rejected. 151 by roll call. The vote is open.